All right, welcome back, guys. So in this video, I actually want to react to a clip from a debate between Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. The clip is probably, I think, a few years old now, but I still want to react to it. And it's regarding, I don't know if the whole debate was about free will, but the clip I'm going to play is the portion of the debate having to do with free will versus determinism. And so not every video on this channel is going to be about atheism, but I just felt like making a couple videos about it. So like I said in my previous videos, I've never heard of any rational argument from an atheist. At least, I just feel like no argument I've ever heard has been reasonable to me, right? I think all of them are based on fallacies or irrationality, unwarranted presumptions about the way reality works, all of them, right? And so this is just another one. So a very common argument from atheists, right? One that they're kind of almost like forced into, despite how obvious it is, it doesn't make any sense, is the idea of determinism, right? So free will is basically just the idea that we choose what we wish and what we wish to think and things like that, or choose our thoughts. Determinism is basically the idea that what we choose to think and what we choose to do is determined by a prior cause. Now, obviously, in my opinion, determinism makes no sense at all, right? Obviously, I'm experiencing my own free will. Of course, an atheist would say experience doesn't necessarily indicate reality. It can, what I'm experiencing can seem like many things that it actually isn't, which that's not exactly true in the way they say. They usually base it on they usually predicate that description or that assertion on the materialist model of experience, which is obviously false because you could poke a million holes in it, right? But I'm going to play the clip, but I just wanted to give that introduction to say that atheists generally sort of push the idea of determinism because they kind of have to, right? Even though it makes no sense, because they say there's no evidence of God. And usually they don't believe in anything supernatural. It has to support the idea that there's no evidence of God. But I'm going to play the clip and then I'm going to react to it.
I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological
My neurons are firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist, and we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings.
All right, so I actually wanted to react to that portion of the clip. So you can already see that he's employing or using a very common argument or talking point from atheists, right? So he's saying that basically we might think or feel like we're using free will, but he says, no, that's just an illusion. That's an illusion created by evolution, right? And the purpose of that, as well as our feelings, is to enforce certain behaviors, that allow us to survive, make smart decisions, and to work in groups and things like that. And so, actually, before I get into it further, I forgot to mention, so my name is Chuck, if you're new to the channel. I created a theory that basically explains the mechanics of the spirit realm. It all revolves around what we would call the subconscious mind. If you're interested in learning that, it's free. I'm going to create a free 2-semester course, roughly. It's on my website, subconsciousenergymechanics.com, and the link is in the description. So I created a theory where I actually can explain how thoughts work, how emotions work, how creativity works, how dreams work, right? And what I'm saying is that this is what atheists a lot of times will do, right? A lot of the things that are obviously supernatural, like thoughts, emotions, dreams, right? Atheists will be able to explain these things up to a point, right? Because these things interact with physics. They interact with our physical body, right? So our physical body influences these things, but it's not directly created or caused by these things, by the body, right? So to get to what you need to fully explain the nature of thought, consciousness, emotions, things like that, is you need a more complete theory of consciousness. You can only do that literally with a metaphysical theory because they're metaphysical. So there are many things that science can't explain that I can easily explain, right? So I can explain how emotions work, right? So a lot of atheists think that that we know how emotions work. We don't. I always have to tell that to atheists because they don't realize that, right? There's no consensus on how emotions work in science because no one's been able to. You can always find a contradiction in every leading theory. Here's the problem. Every leading theory is based on a materialist model. That's why you could point a contradiction in it, right? Like, so my theory, I can explain everything in spades, any angle, right? So even, in fact, I even talk about depression in my course, how that works, what's caused by it. I actually have to update some videos about that too. But anyway, I explain all those things, right? So when you have a a metaphysical model, or you have a theory that properly explains how these things work, I say that you can't possibly do that without having a metaphysical theory or metaphysical modeling these things in terms of metaphysics. Now, because of their metaphysical, you'll always only be able to explain these things up to a point through a purely physical or material model. And what atheists do is they always will get to a certain point and then just fill in the rest with their own imagination, right? They always do that. And you can see he's doing it there. Now he's saying that evolution is the cause for the experience of free will. Okay, no problem. Wouldn't you have to actually explain how consciousness works, how emotions work, how dreams work? All these faculties and properties of consciousness, you kind of have to explain them, not just, in order to explain them in terms of evolution, you have to explain them in terms of biology, because evolution is fundamentally a biological phenomena, right? So you have to explain these things solely in terms of biology before you can get to an evolutionary argument. So explain them. Tell me how emotions work purely through the biology. Of course, they can't do that, right? So a lot of times what atheists will say, oh, the emergence phenomena, right? That's how consciousness works. That's where emotions comes from. Here's what a lot of people don't understand, including atheists. The emergence theory is not a scientific argument, right? It is a faith-based argument, period. I'm going to say that again, right? I feel it has to be said twice. Emergence is not a scientific argument, right? It is a faith-based argument. It is an argument that is based on materialist faith. So atheists have faith just like spiritual people have faith. Their faith is in materialism, right? When there's something they're faced with that they can't explain, they appeal to the magic of materialism. I call it atheist magic, right? So an atheist will always say, oh, when someone who believes in God can't explain something, and I'm specifically referring to atheists who don't believe in the supernatural, right? So some do, but most don't. But when an atheist is faced with something they can't explain, they say, oh, well, if we can't explain it, you just believe in God. No, that's not what we're doing. That's what you're doing with saying that God doesn't exist. So when you're faced with something you can't explain, you just say it doesn't prove God and then just insert your own random imagination into what does explain it. No. What people actually believe in God are doing is they're looking at something they can't explain and they're saying that belief in God and the supernatural is the most plausible explanation, and it's a better model. So what we say, what the idea of what we're trying to do when we understand reality is make predictions, right? So epistemologically, when we say we know something's true in reality, it's based on some prediction we're making relative to some theory, right? I know physics is true because based on the theory of physics, if I do this, this, and that, I can predict the outcome. Maybe the theory's still wrong. Who knows? Maybe it's just a coincidence that physical matter is doing what my theory says it does. But until I can prove otherwise, I'm going to say that the theory is true because it makes predictions. The same thing is true metaphysically. Now, not all theories are perfect models of what we see. General relativity is a great theory of gravity, but it doesn't explain everything, right? And that we recognize. But right now, it's the best theory we have. And the same thing's true of God and metaphysics, right? So we have a metaphysical theory that explains emotions, spiritual experiences, dreams, demonic experiences, experience with God, things like that, right? Right now, that theory is a great model for what people say they experience. It's a great model for thoughts. It's a great model for emotions. It even explains the beginning of the universe, things like that, right? This model doesn't explain any of those things, right? In other words, the metaphysical theory is a superior theory and therefore should be kept than the atheist model, which is completely inferior and should be thrown out because it explains less things, right? And so do atheists do that? 'Cause it would be a far more logical thing to just pick the superior theory. General relativity doesn't explain everything, but it was assumed to be true and preferred over Newton's theory of gravity because general relativity explained more things, right? It could explain things better than the Newtonian model, like the orbit of Mercury, right? And the planet Mercury. So it made sense to throw out, not completely throw out the Newtonian model, but to promote the general relativity, Einstein's theory, basically to the most complete theory of gravity that we have, even though it's incomplete in totality. So the same thing should be done with atheism or the materialist model. It explains less things, therefore should be thrown out. Now, is that what atheists do? Because it should, in other words, it's the most logical thing to do, and is that what atheists do? Of course not, right? They just ignore everything they can't explain. They just make up something in their imagination. They always come up with some excuse why it doesn't count, right? Or when a person has a spiritual experience or they can't explain conscience or emotions, they just make up some random nonsense and say, it doesn't. They'll say the metaphysical model doesn't prove anything. They make up some random nonsense about how this supernatural phenomena could be related to material model, and then you just keep the material model anyway. And you see that's kind of what he's doing. He says how evolution explains feelings and behaviors. No, it doesn't, right? You would need a biological model that explains, a biological theory that explains nature of thoughts and emotions, which we don't have. So therefore you have no right to say that evolution explains these things. It makes no sense, right? If there weren't so many things we've seen that couldn't be explained in the material model, you might be okay. But there are many things we see. And the metaphysical model is completely superior in terms of explaining these things. So it makes no sense to say that free will doesn't exist on the basis of evolution. But of course, atheists generally don't make any sense, right? So I just want to respond to that. I kind of ranted much longer than I wanted to. But yeah, I'll play the next clip.
And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind, or inside your brain, or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. Because you still need to, it's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
so I would be careful.
That does argue.
Okay, so I wanted to react to that clip. That's actually the main part I want to react to. So this is something I notice atheists always do, right? And you can kind of see that he was trying to avoid this, but he still did it anyway, right? Because what atheists a lot of times will do is they always have this baked-in belief reflecting their own personal bias about how reality should work, and they will incorporate that belief into their analysis of reality. Now, like I said in previous videos, there's no scientist who would do that with reality, right? They would actually study reality. They have certain opinions about how reality should work, but they validate what they say they know about reality based on theory, based on the predictive nature of theory, right? If I predict this will happen, from the experiments I set up, this seems to happen all the time, therefore I know this is how reality works. Now, what an atheist will do is say, I logically think this is how reality functions, therefore that's how reality works. That doesn't make any sense, right? Reality is not guaranteed to be confined to whatever logical propositions you made up in your head. Now, in his case, he said that if something is influencing you to make a decision, then clearly your will is determined, right? But if something isn't influencing you, then it must just be random. That's not true. Where did he get that from, right? That's his own sort of, he imposed that requirement on reality. Why? So, for example, he also, actually, before I go into, he also said, well, what if someone's talking about the soul? He said, no problem. I don't even have to use a materialist model, right? If someone's talking about the soul, it's the same condition, right? If there's something inside the soul making a decision, either something's influencing the soul, or if nothing's influencing the soul, then it's making a decision at random, right? Which doesn't make any sense. So either free will is, either you're making decision at random, or you're making a decision that's determined by something else, but the will isn't actually free. Here's the problem with that, right? You just made it up that that's your only two options, which is what atheists always do, right? So first of all, it is perfectly possible for the soul. It's not possible for materialism. It's perfectly possible for the soul to be its own cause. So what do I mean by that? Meaning that my will could be free and I could be the cause of it without it being random, right? You might say, well, how's that possible? The same way it's possible for God to exist, right? The same way any first cause in nature exists, right? And this is the problem with the materialist model of reality. It is incapable of explaining first cause phenomena, right? So free will is a first cause phenomena. It's a first cause that has no prior cause, and you can't explain it in terms of by a first cause. More specifically, physics itself can never explain first cause phenomena, right? It always requires you to input some variable based on something you see, which is going to be some secondary cause of some initial cause, right? So if I have an experiment and I flick like a pendulum or something, and I start doing an equation based on that, my flicking the pendulum is the initial cause that began that system, right? That allowed me to analyze it, at least in terms of it moving, right? The beginning of the universe is a first cause. Physics can't explain that. Thoughts are a first cause. Physics can't explain it. And emotions are a first cause. Physics can't explain it. Another one that atheists a lot of times don't recognize, they're always kind of surprised by this, is even moving, right? That's a first cause event. Science doesn't know how people are able to move. What atheists will usually say, oh, no, we know it comes from this region of the brain, whatever region, right? They say it comes from that region. So, right, what you're actually saying is that motion correlates to that region. And they'll say, no, if the brain gets damaged, then that person can't move. No, if the brain gets damaged, the signal is not able to be sent for some reason, right? But if the brain is working fine, you still can't say what the first cause event is that causes the signal that results in motion of your arms to fire, or motion of whatever to fire. Science still doesn't know how it works. They don't know what causes it, because science or physics cannot explain first cause events, just like it can't explain the beginning of the universe. God, the existence of the universe, I should say, is a first cause event, and God is the uncaused cause. And here's another thing with atheism, right? Now, you may not even accept that. You may say, oh, no, because I've seen atheists say this before. Oh, you're just saying that to try to fill in a mystery because you can't explain how God could be an uncaused cause, right? And that's what atheists always say. Oh, if you're saying the universe couldn't have come out of nowhere, then where did God come from? Like, okay, obviously we're here, right? So at some point there was an uncaused cause. That's not the issue. You can't get around the uncaused cause paradox, nor can I. Here's the difference. Which uncaused cause explanation makes more sense? The explanation of God, or just a universe which isn't supernatural, just randomly causing itself in an uncaused way? Obviously that makes no sense. And even if you were to take that theory, which atheists do, how do you explain all these spiritual experiences with God? How do you explain these supernatural experiences like emotions, like consciousness, like dreams? Well, I could say energy. A lot of people don't know about that stuff. I talk about that stuff in my course. Energy, the placebo effect, psychic abilities. I talk about psychic abilities in my course too, how they work. Atheists say that there's no evidence for psychic abilities. That's not true, right? They just make that up like usual, right? And I cover all that stuff in my course. How do you explain all these? These events are what we would expect to see in a universe that has God. The things we wouldn't expect to see any of that stuff in a universe that didn't have God, right? So of course we see things we do expect. Now, do atheists say that because of that, probably there's a God? Of course not. They'll make up some excuse like they always do. And here's the other thing. Even if you said that you took the idea that the universe wasn't caused by anything and there's no God, right? How on earth would you get around the determinism problem that way? This is what I've never understood about this argument, right? So if free will is caused by some prior cause, therefore if our decisions are caused by some prior cause and therefore it's deterministic and not a function of free will, well, what caused the prior cause? Right? How does my brain get around the first cause problem? How does not appealing to a soul being able to cause itself or cause its own actions, which is why we're created in the image of God, because we can actually choose, just like God has the ability to choose in an uncaused way, and it's not random, right? If we don't have that ability, how do you solve that by appealing to a material brain, right? Okay, I made a decision based on functions in the brain. Okay, why did those functions cause me to make that decision? Well, interaction of neurons and things like that. Okay, what caused the interaction of neurons to make that decision? Well, the atomic structure of the neurons, I guess. Okay, why did atomic structures? And I can play this game all day. I can play it all day until we're either going to go infinitely, which is what some atheists actually believe in. I think it's called infinitism, right? And they just do that basically because they know their logic makes no sense. So they have to create this nonsensical logical paradigm in order to make their logic make sense. So they'll say, oh, no, it is an infinite number of causes. And that's it. We just can't get to the end because it's an infinite number of causes. Even though all spiritual experiences say that's not true. It's a first cause event, right? But of course, spiritual experiences don't count. It's always someone imagining it. It's always someone hallucinating. It's always someone dreaming. It's always someone on drugs or lying, right? All throughout history, in all the events that not a single one of them, right, as far as I know, said infinitism was correct, right? It's still ignore all these events and then believe in infinitism just because it's the only thing you can kind of do to make it almost work, the idea of determinism. And obviously it makes no sense, right? You have not gotten around the first cause problem just because you appeal to a physical model. You still have to explain the first cause, right? Of the first cause that led to decisions being made in the brain. And decisions being made through the brain in a purely materialistic model, which you can obviously see he didn't even do. He didn't even try to do that, right? He just said that if you have a soul, it must be, it can't be its own cause. It has to be caused by something else or it's random. No, that's how materials work. A supernatural substance is not required to be confined to those rules like materialism, right? So you see he actually imposed his own materialist bias onto something immaterial, even though he said he was going to not do that, right? And this is what atheists always do. They always include their own materialist bias into explanations of supernatural or into explanations of God, which is why their beliefs make no sense. And that's what you've seen with his. But and Ben Shapiro actually, he didn't quite allude to it the way I'm saying it here or say it directly, but he did kind of explain it in his response, which I'll actually play that part.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self. Right? I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer. Right? As though if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like there's the microchip, and you've got the processor, you got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves as selves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down into, so which parts of the deciding being, that is an avoidance strategy. So I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Exactly, right? So you can actually see that Ben Shapiro caught it as well, right? So he actually said that he's using the word self in different ways. And he said that he basically alluded to the idea that if you accept the self, especially as a soul, then you would accept it as a deciding being, right? In other words, your ability to choose is actually innate to the nature of the soul. What Alex O'Connor is doing, like I said before, is he's imposing the limits and the constrictions on materials onto the soul, something supernatural, something you're not warranted to do, right? If it's supernatural, by definition, there's no reason to expect it to have the same limits as materials. Of course, Alex O'Connor surreptitiously just threw that assumption in there like atheists always do. They always do that, right? With every belief and every claim, they always insert their random sort of materialistic imagination onto something, and then they'll make claims about how reality works or should work based on whatever they just made up in their head, which you see, that's exactly what he did there, right? So the soul can't have free will by itself based on the random limit he just put on it in his head, right? And what Ben Shapiro called it. And the rest of Ben Shapiro's argument, it kind of points to that, right? And he actually says in the end, I think at the end of the clip I was watching, he says it as well, right? I don't know exactly how the soul works, how the universe works, things like that, but that's a giant escape hatch or mechanism. He said something to that effect, right? Which is also true for determinism. That's also true for atheists regarding the material model. There's also many things they don't understand. The difference is the supernatural model is a much better explanation, therefore superior, right? Now, what atheists do, they don't take the better explanation, like I said. They just, because they're biased, they'll just say, no, I don't accept that, even though it's a better explanation. I'll take mine, even though it's a worse explanation, and I'll just say that whatever I can't explain doesn't exist in a supernatural way for some imaginary reason I'll just make up in my head. They have many excuses, right? And they'll just usually say either science will one day figure it out, they'll say it was just a big coincidence, right, when something happens that statistically is basically impossible, which is another example of a supernatural phenomena. They'll just say it was a big coincidence. Or what's the last one? It's usually the big three. Three of their favorite excuse atheists use is that one day science will figure it out. The other excuse they say is, it was a big coincidence. And the other one is that you imagined it was in your head, you're delusional, something. It's always those three excuses that explain away the supernatural. And you kind of see that's what he's doing here, right? So we clearly experience free will. Now that alone, I would accept that alone doesn't prove it. But when you combine that with the supernatural, with the evidence of the supernatural, in other words, if we use a supernatural theory or a supernatural model to explain consciousness, dreams, thoughts, things like that, we're able to make much better predictions, right? And as well as with spiritual experiences and things like that. All of these things work together to pretty much confirm the free will model, right? Now, what the atheist will do is say none of that counts, right? All these spiritual experiences with God confirming the free will model, they were all made up, they were all delusional, they were all imagined, it was all in our head for all of history, right? Even though they can't explain how any of it works at all, and they'll just go by the material model, even though it's clearly inferior and can explain less. Why? Because they're just biased, all right? And so that's kind of what I want to get into in the video, right? So atheists in general, right, they have confirmation bias, right? What the biggest problem I've noticed about atheists is that they don't want themselves to be the reason why they don't know God, right? Because God, you know God through the purity of your heart, right? Like I said before, God doesn't expect people to know him through intellectual analysis. Atheists just made that up on their own, right? If you just follow the purity of your heart, you're always going to find your way back to God because that's how he constructed your soul. Now, I actually have a theory to pretty much back that up, which I have, which I put on my website. What the atheist says is, I don't know how emotions work. I'll just say it works through materialism, even though I can't explain it through materialism. And using this inferior model, I'll say that following the purity of your heart can't lead yourself back to God because it actually follows material model, even though the material model doesn't fully explain feelings, right? It makes no sense, but that's generally what they believe in, right? And so, like I said, atheists will make up every excuse in the book so that they're not the reason for not knowing God, right? Because God doesn't ask you to find him through your mind. He set up reality the way he did so that any person who just chooses to walk in purity, and he designed your soul to have fixed responses. You can't change how it responds to certain things. You can change some aspects of that response, which I talk about in chapter 7, but you can't change it Absolutely. There's some components of the way your soul responds to events that's fixed and you can't change. And that's what you're supposed to use to find your way back to God. And that's reflective of what the Bible says about the law being written on a man's heart. Right? You're not even supposed to know in your mind. If you actually want the goodness of God, you'll just follow that sense of purity back to God. Now, atheists, they're not following that sense of purity. That's why they don't know God. But they're not going to say, well, maybe it's me is the reason I don't know God. No, they never want it to be them. So they're avoiding accountability. So they'll make up every excuse in the book as to why God doesn't exist, and this isn't evidence of God, and this and that. Also, they're not the reason for not knowing God. That's always how they act. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to that clip in this video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.